All right. Well, today we're wrapping up our series, Living the Dream. And if you are new with us, you missed any part of the series, you can go on our website and watch any message anytime. And this is really one conversation we've had over 4 weeks. So it'll make more sense if you go back and you watch some of those. But the question we've been asking over the last several weeks is this: is it possible for two people who fall in love to stay in love forever? Now, I put this disclaimer out there every week. This is a relationship series, so if you've got any relationship with any human being, raise your hand. Let me see your hands. You've got a relationship with somebody. See, that's everybody, except for you. You didn't raise your hand. I don't know why you didn't raise your hand. So this will help you because this is in truth helpful for all relationships. But we've been fine-tuning the conversation a little bit more to help us in that one special someone relationship, that one special someone. So is it possible for two people to fall in love and stay in love forever? And we've said that, regardless of our past experiences, regardless of whether or not we had a good example from mom or dad, regardless of where we're at right now, we think deep down in our hearts, we think it's possible. And we think it's possible for us. We all believe that somewhere out there is that one special someone that if we just met them and we'd fall in love, we'd stay in love. We wouldn't just stay married, but we would stay in love. And we would have that thing, that spark, that passion, that romance that we had at the beginning, and that would last a lifetime. And I think that part of the reason why we believe that is because that's God's fingerprint in our life to want that. But we've also said that if you're going to fall in love and you're going to stay in love, the first thing you're going to have to do is learn how to make love a verb, right? Learn how to make love a verb. And maybe at the beginning it was a noun you fell into. It was a place I fell in love. But if you want to stay in love with that one special someone, you're going to learn how to show it, not just say it. You're going to learn how to do what love requires. And so we said that the best model, if you want to stay in love, the best model for that is to follow the example of Christ. The best way for us to love the person we want to love well is to take our cue from Jesus, not necessarily from our culture, not necessarily from maybe other relationships that we see out there. He's perfect. He was selfless. He put our needs first. He surrendered himself, submitted himself, made you more important, got interested in what interests you. And so we talked about that we should take our cues from him if we want to know how to love well. And last week, we said that you got to learn how to pay attention to what's inside of you, right? How many of you remember I introduced you to a couple friends of mine, Mr. and Mrs. Mugg? I'm happy to report the Muggs are doing well. They had a great week. They've recovered and repaired the damage in their relationship. But if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you got to go back and watch that on our website because that will make a lot more sense to you. But what we talked about was this: what's inside of us will come out of us no matter who's with us. And so we discovered that we all have stuff inside, baggage in our hearts from past relationships that is just kind of there, and we brought it into the relationships that we're in now. And part of learning how to stay in love is learning how to navigate and work out those things that are inside of us, because if we don't know, they will eventually come out, and when they do, they have the potential to do a lot of damage unless we're wise and we work through that. And so today, as we wrap up this conversation, I want to talk about a decision that we have to make. Everybody who is in love and who stays in love makes this single decision if they want to continue to stay in love. And it's a kind of fill-in-the-blank kind of choice for you. You get to decide what your answer is going to be. Every single day, you decide whether, with regard to this question we're going to talk about, will you or will you not? Will you make this choice or will you not? But I want to tell you that couples who stay in love make the right choice, and the couples who don't make the right choice. And so my goal today, as you can see, I've got something up here. I'll kind of illustrate this with a word picture, a little visual aid. I can't promise it'll be as exciting as last week, but nevertheless, hopefully it'll drive the point home, because everybody who's in love and stays in love makes the choice we're going to wrestle with. And this is something you did intuitively when you fell in love, when you met each other, but over the course of time, it's easy to stop doing because we can just, and we'll talk about why that happens. So we're going to walk through a few verses here this morning from the New Testament book written by a guy named Paul called 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 13. And even if you're here and you're not a church person and you have no idea what in the world we're talking about, like you probably heard some of these verses before. You didn't even know it was in the Bible. And it's found in 1 Corinthians 13, and it's called the love chapter. Everybody go, love. It's the love chapter, right? And he's writing this letter to believers who live in a city called Corinth. And chapter 13, this love chapter, you probably even had some of this read at your wedding and you didn't even realize it was in the Bible. And as we read through some of these verses, you're going to realize that what we read, a lot of it makes sense. You're going to read some of these and you're going to go, well, yeah, obviously. I mean, I need to work on that. That's true. Love, to do that. I need to get better at that. That's a good reminder, Jason. Sure, love does these things, but we're going to get to one verse, verse 7, and we're going to get to one phrase in verse 7 that doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't even sound like good advice. It sounds actually unrealistic, but it's something that people who stay in love do all the time. And instead of making just one statement, he makes four, and Paul drives this this repetition into making this bigger point. So we're going to start with a few verses leading up to verse 7. Start with verse 4, and I think you would all agree as he says, love is patient, love is kind, love, it does not envy. It does not boast. It's not proud. How many, you probably are nodding. Yeah, it's probably a good idea to be patient with the people that you love, right? Don't be impatient. That drives people away. It's not a good idea to be mean. Would you agree it's a good idea to be kind and nice to the people that you love? I mean, if you want to stay in love very long, you're going to do that. It doesn't envy. It's not jealous. And how many of you agree pride is a bad thing? Arrogance is a bad thing in a relationship. We don't really like those kinds of people very long, do we? So this is easy. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Paul. I agree with everything you're saying so far. In verse 5 says it doesn't dishonor. That's true. Yeah, you want to honor him. It's not selfish. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Now, come on, how many of you grew up in a house where that was not the case, right? Mom could bring back in the file cabinet something dad did 20 years ago and just throw it out there like it happened yesterday. Anybody grew up in a house like that? This was normal, right? This is what love does, and so we see sometimes the opposite of that. Verse 6, we agree so far with everything Paul's saying. It doesn't delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth. Now, all that's good. All that, we would agree with all that. Deep down, when we hear those things, we all know they're true, and we know that we need to work on them. We can get better in some of them, especially if we want to stay in love and live the dream. But then he gets to verse 7. Aha, this is the verse. And he takes this little Greek word, and he uses this same word 4 times, and he attaches 4 separate words to it, to make one simple point. And if you just take one of these 4 out, they don't make sense. It seems unrealistic. But Paul puts them together to make a very important point, because this is one of the most important habits and practices of what it looks like to stay in love. And here's how he says it. In verse 7, he says, love, it always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Now, that's the NIV. That's an easier translation to read, but there are other translations, if you didn't know that. There's like a gazillion. But some of them are more formal. They're more word for word exactly what the original language says. And one of those is called the English Standard Version, the ESV. Check out how it translates it. It says, love, it bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. Now, when we read that, let's leave that up there for a little bit. When we read, it believes all things, that's the phrase I was talking about a minute ago. When I read that, maybe you're like me and you're kind of thinking, well, doesn't that seem a little ridiculous? Doesn't that seem to make love blind? Love's not blind. Love believes all things. It always trusts. I mean, what if in my relationship there's evidence to the contrary? Am I supposed to be in a relationship and just believe everything that they say, even if the evidence seems to point in the opposite direction, and even if my past experiences seem to make me feel like they're doing again what I felt like happened to me? I mean, what if they've done something, Jason, that disappoints me, or something that breaks my trust, that causes me not to believe all things? What then? And like I said, if you pull one of those 4 out, they don't seem to make sense. Seems like bad advice. But he's putting it all together to make a simple, powerful point. So out of all the things Paul writes here about love, this one phrase is the one that seems the most unrealistic. I don't know about that one. I don't know if I can do that one. But here's the powerful thought here. And this is to explain kind of what he's getting at, and to help illustrate that. I want to show you a little bit. Then I want to come back and I want to reread that verse through this filter we're going to create. Because in every single relationship that you have, at some point along the way, there's a gap. There's a gap between the things that you expect, our expectations, and there's a gap between what your partner, your spouse, actually does. right? You thought that they were going to, but they did. There's always a gap in every relationship. It doesn't matter. Your kids, your spouse, your parents, your coworkers, your boss, your neighbor, in every relationship, there is a gap between what you expected them to do and what they actually did, right? In every relationship, there's a gap. I expected that you were going to, but in actuality, you didn't. You said you'd be here at 4 o'clock, but it's 4:15. Where are you at? 4:30, you're still not here. You said from now on you would do these chores. Come on, parents, right? But what happened? You still haven't called. You promised you would call when you got, but you haven't called. You said you'd drop the kids off, but here I am doing it again. You said you'd stop spending beyond the budget. And look what happened. You keep spending. And you said you'd never do that again. But look what you did. You did it again. A gap. There's always a gap in every relationship. And at some point in every relationship, there's a gap between what you expected and what they actually do. And it could be deep, and it could be, or it could be shallow. It could be specific, or it could be general. Maybe you grew up in it, and you said, when we got into the marriage, my mama always made dinner. My dad always did. But why aren't you doing what my dad always did? Anybody else run into any of this stuff when you got married? There's always expectations, there's always reality, and there's always a gap. Now, in that gap, you have a choice to make. In every single one of these gaps, you put something. You make a decision. You either choose to believe the best about your partner, or you choose to assume the worst. That's the choice that you make every single day. You either believe the best about them, trust that there's got to be some generous explanation for why there's a gap, or you just assume the worst. You make this choice every single day, and you don't even realize that you make it. You believe the best, or you assume the worst. And you already know what your spouse does, so we don't need to talk about that. It's harder to see what we do. But whatever we choose in the gap, whatever your choice is in the gap, you need to understand it starts right up here in your minds. In your relationship, the moment when your partner does something different than what you expected, the moment that there's a gap, you immediately go somewhere in a direction in your mind. And if you believe the best, well, then maybe you're thinking, well, she's been really busy. There's a lot going on in her life. She's done so much, but I'm sure there's a good reason why she's not here and she didn't do what she said she was going to do. I'm going to believe the best. She's got a lot going on in her world. But if you assume the worst, she never does what she promises. Just like last time when she didn't. She never pays attention to the things that I say. It's like I don't even matter to her. I bet she's not even looking at the clock. She said she would be here. She's probably on the phone with her sister again, It's clear she is bad. I'm not important. And you assume the worst. And when there's a gap, if you assume the worst, every time 100%, you will always begin to develop a negative attitude. It's human nature. For example, when it comes to money and your relationships, if you discover your spouse is spending beyond the budget, when you believe the best about them, what you believe is, we've been so busy, there's been a lot going on this month. He's probably not even aware that he did it. Maybe he's distracted. Maybe he really wasn't thinking clearly. We had agreed not to, but he did it. You give him the benefit of the doubt. There's a lot going on at work. He's really stressed. You're trusting him, trusting that there's a reasonable explanation. But if you assume the worst, then you develop an attitude. Come on, that's when the head rolls start. You know what I'm talking about? He's just so lazy. He's so sloppy. He's no good with, I don't know why that voice comes out of me. I really don't know. He's no good with money. His daddy never was not good with money. His granddaddy was good with money. How can somebody be so careless, so sloppy? It's like I got to do everything around here. He makes me so mad. When he gets home, ooh, just wait, right? And because you assume the worst, you start building up an attitude. And you're ready to blast him when he walks through the doors. And the point is that in all of our relationships, there's a gap. There always will be a gap. No person will perfectly ever live up to your expectations. Can I get an amen, anybody? So whatever you put in your mind about them and the reason why there's a gap, whatever happens in here, it's going to come out of here. And it's going to hurt the relationship here. And there are two things that determine what you put in the gap. Two things that determine what you put in the gap. It's what you can see And it's what you've experienced. It's who you are. It's all of your past relationships, all of your hurts, all the good, the bad, the ugly, all the people who've been there for you, who have hurt you. It's what you see, and that's the easy thing to recognize. I see she hasn't. I see he didn't, and I can see it. I can see it in real time. That's part of what leads you to think what you think and choose what you choose in the gap. What you see, but the other part is much harder to see. It's the deeper part. It's the who you are, like we talked about last week. It's the stuff that's inside that's going to come out when you get bumped because you came into the relationship with baggage from your past. And so maybe it's your parents, or maybe it's your friends, or maybe it was a past romantic relationship. And the reality is that no one comes out of any of those relationships without some dings and some dents, whether they were good or not so good, helpful or hurtful. Those past relationships they trigger something in you, and they can affect you today without even realizing it. And some of us had so many kind of negative experiences that they haven't just affected us, they've infected us. And a word or an attitude or an eye roll or a look just gets that, and it triggers you because it was exactly what mom did, exactly what dad did, exactly what they did. And it's not in the current relationship, it's in the past, but it's deep inside of you, and it comes out. And if you've been married for very long, you know it doesn't take long for your partner, your spouse, to trigger something in you that lived in you from long ago, right? A word, a look. It's what you see. It's who you are. You bring all of that, and you put it in the gap. So let me ask you a question. In your mind, when the gap happens, which way do you go? Where do you tend to go? Do you tend to believe the best? Do you tend to assume the worst? As soon as you get the email, as soon as you get the phone call, as soon as you get the text, I'm going to be late again. I can't go pick up the kids. I know I said I would, but I wasn't able to take care of that. I got held up and I wasn't able to make it to the grocery store. Where do you go when there's a gap? Which way do you lean? Which way do you tend to go? Now, before we go any further, let me tell you what I think some of you at least might be thinking. You're probably thinking, Jason, if you would just put away your little signs for a second and quit playing with your toys, I'll tell you all about my spouse and all about why I assume the worst. I mean, if you just knew and you just understood my sad story, you would know why this is an impossibility with him and this is the reality with him. If you would just sit down for 5 minutes, I'll tell you, Jason. And I would tell you this. I've heard over 20 years as a pastor, I've heard every sad story. And I could probably trump your sad story with somebody else's sad story. And I'm not saying that to make light of their stories. I'm not saying that to be naive. I'm not saying that to be insensitive. That's just, I understand the real world. I live in it. I am married. I get it. But if you could just for a second put on hold your sad story and listen to what Paul is getting at, it might help you. Even if you don't believe in God, even if you don't believe in Jesus, this will still help you. Where do you go? Where do you tend to go mentally when there's a gap between your expectations and their behavior? Because people who learn to stay in love learn to believe the best. This is the decision that they make intentionally. Whether it's a force of discipline and habit or whether it's intuitively, they learn to believe the best about their partner, and they do that regardless of what they see and regardless of what they feel and have felt in the past and who they are. They choose to make the conscious decision. When you find a couple that's crazy in love after so many years, you're going to find people who choose to believe the best about each other no matter what they see, no matter what's happened in their past. And you're never going to find a couple where there's not a gap. There's always a gap. Every relationship has one. For as long as there are relationships with people, having relationships with people, you're going to have gaps. But those couples who stay in love, what you're going to find are people who make a habit out of believing the best, choosing it, which means that, the gap between expectations and behavior is not the issue. It's the choice we make that is the issue of whether or not we are staying in love with them. They choose to be, here's a word I want you to write down, generous. Generous in their explanation for why the gap exists. You could be generous or you could be critical. You can be generous or you could be critical, but you cannot be both. One choice leads to staying in love, the other makes love fade away. And this holds up in real life, doesn't it? I mean, in unhappy relationships, there's a connection, isn't there, between assuming the worst of each other and that couple's happiness. Whenever you criticize, whenever we've been criticized, whether people have assumed the worst, it pushes us further and further away from one another. But believing in each other, loving one another, giving each other grace, and having a generous attitude toward one another, it actually gives us space to move in a better direction. Your choice, if you struggle with this, and sometimes I naturally struggle with this. I wish I were an optimist. I wish I was a glass half full kind of guy. I'm half empty. Anybody else like me? I can pick apart, and my expectations are high, and I can rip apart the people I love the most without realizing it. But here's what I've learned in my life. Maybe you've experienced this in yours. When I assume the worst, it always leads to a negative downward spiral. I call it the toilet bowl syndrome of relationships. It feeds on itself. When I continue to assume the worst, I'm always going to find something to criticize. But couples who believe the best, couples who choose intentionally to believe the best, and who are gracious to one another, and who are generous in their love for one another, who come up with a generous explanation for why the gap exists, well, they create a positive upward spiral. It exalts, it lifts that relationship up. Believing the best, giving your partner the benefit of the doubt when there's a gap, directly affects the environment, the experience of the relationship. One sends it down the toilet, one pushes it up on and puts it on a throne and exalts it. And in this kind of dynamic, in this context, here's something you've got to be aware of. Whether you assume the worst or believe the best, you've got to know that people will either live up to or down to the way you think about them, speak to them, and treat them. Parents, this is true for your kids. This is true for your spouse. This is true for your coworkers. This is true for everybody you got relationships with. You have the potential every single day in your relationships to send your relationships up or to flush them down the toilet. Downward into a spiral of criticism and negativity, or upward into this cycle of joy and space and freedom and grace and love and trust because you chose to believe the best. If every relationship has gaps, there are always going to be gaps, and it's your response in the gaps that determines whether your relationship is moving in the right direction or not. It's entirely your choice. So couples who stay married and who stay in love aren't the ones who let what they see or what they feel or what they've experienced in their past affect the way that they think about their partner. Despite what they see, despite what's happened to them, they choose to trust and to believe in their partner and their spouse. They choose to be gracious and generous in terms of why there's a gap. And before you think this is weird, and before you think this is totally impossible for you to do, let me just tell you this. This is exactly what you did at the start of your relationship. Remember when you fell in love? Remember when you thought, ladies, he was the greatest thing since sliced bread? Remember when you thought there was no issue with her at all, guys? Remember when people would come and say, well, but I want you to know, I want you to be aware of, he kind of, and you're like, no, he's good. I just want you to understand, she struggles with, no, she's amazing. You covered up, come on, you all are like me, you covered up what you heard with the illusion of what you believed about them. Am I right? When you believe the best, it creates a positive image of that person and it leads you to trust them. And that trust fosters intimacy. And that intimacy, guys, that results in love. It's an upward cycle. We all did it really well when we started out in the relationships, but the problem is we stopped doing it, and we stopped doing it because of what we see, and because what we see reminds us of what happened to us, and we stop choosing to believe the best because of what we see and because of who we are. But a husband and a wife who continues to believe the best, not assume the worst, will have a better view of each other, will have greater feelings of love for one another, and their marriage will have a positive dynamic. Because when you believe the best, instead of assuming the worst, and you determine there's got to be a good explanation for why there's a gap, and I'm going to trust them instead of criticizing them, it generates love. It rebuilds love. It pulls love and your marriage and your relationship out of the toilet, guys, ladies, and it puts it back to where God wanted it to be. And this is the choice that people who stay in love make every single day. So if you want to stay in love, here's my advice. It's not mine. It's actually Paul's. I can't take credit. The Lord gave it to him too. So I guess this is God's advice. Look for and create the most generous explanation for why there's a gap in your relationship. Between your expectation and what your partner, your spouse does, not just that, once you've created the most gracious, I'm not talking about a good one, like the best, over-the-top, gracious one, then choose to believe it over what you see and over what you've experienced. That's what couples who stay in love learn to do. They learn to discipline themselves, and they choose to be generous in their explanation for the gap. So where do you go with this naturally? Where's your tendency? Do you quickly go negative? Do you quickly go positive? Because whatever you do in the gap, you cannot blame them. It's your decision. And the Apostle Paul says, love bears, believes, hopes, and perseveres all things. It believes the best. Now, what Paul wrote was written over 2,000 years ago, and it's crazy to think that what was written over 2,000 years ago might be the key today to saving your marriage. Because some of you might have today, you're here, and maybe even it's your first time or you're watching online, you have grown so far apart in your relationship with your spouse, and maybe you think it's hopeless that you will ever feel love again. You fear that you'll never discover or rediscover that same level of passion and joy and happiness that you once had with each other. And you're against divorce, so you're going to gut it out no matter what, but you all both know neither of you are enjoying this. You've stopped believing the best. And now your relationship with the person that you love the most, the person you vowed to love and cherish the most, has become a downward spiral of criticism and negativity. And when that happens, when both of you struggle here in the gap between expectations and behavior, you're both assuming the worst. It's a cycle that doesn't end. Because you're always going to see something to criticize. When you see something that confirms why you feel what you feel or what you see there, I told you, he never does. See, remember, you go to the counselor, see, she did it again. It's a cycle in our minds that keeps looking for more and more problems. And here's the thing about problems. It's not hard to find them. You don't have to look long or hard, especially in relationships, to find something to criticize, do you? It's easy to be a critic. It's a lot harder to choose to discipline this and be somebody who celebrates each other and believes the best. You're always going to find something to criticize. That's not some of you think you have a degree in criticism. That's not something worthwhile to get a degree in. That's not hard to do. But here's something that's even more crazy, and this has been true of me. I will admit this, so maybe this will be true of you. Some of us actually like it when our spouse screws up because it gives us another excuse to be right. See, I told you. We get the leverage back in the relationship, right? I knew you wouldn't. And as twisted as it is in my flesh and in my sin when I make this bad choice, we would rather be right in our negative assumptions than we would care to discipline ourselves to love our spouse well and move the relationship toward a healthier place with our spouse. The choice that couples who fall in love and stay in love make is to believe the best. The choice that couples who fall out of love and get divorced is to do this. 100% of the time, I promise you, if you do this and assume the worst, even if you stay together, you will not stay in love. It will be a relationship full of criticism and complaining and never good enough. Let's listen to what Paul says again in verse 7. Let's go back to this verse with this new filter now. Love always protects. What does it protect? Remember I said all four of these work together. You can't take one out. It protects. What does it protect? It protects the integrity of the relationship. I'm not going to look for something to criticize. I'm going to protect the relationship from me, from what I've gone through, from what I feel, from what I see. I'm going to choose. I'm going to protect you and me from letting that stuff affect us so that I lead our relationship in a negative way. Love protects. I'm going to look for ways to keep love alive. And it always trusts. It always trusts. It always looks to believe the best and give a generous explanation. Even if it doesn't appear that there is one, it chooses to because it always hopes, which means, oh, please, 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 please be true. Because the alternative is no way to live. The alternative is no way to think. If what my worst fear is and it comes true, that's not hope. That's hopeless. So I'm hoping. There's a graciousness here. Hopefully he didn't realize he didn't do that. Hopefully she didn't realize. Hopefully they didn't mean to. Hopefully they weren't aware of. It always hopes. And no matter what, no matter how many times you stumble, no matter how many times you struggle, no matter how many times you don't do this well, it never gives up. It always perseveres. It holds on. It holds on in spite of the hurt and the pain, and it perseveres. It continues to believe the best. It always chooses to look for the good. It protects, it trusts, it hopes, it perseveres. These 4 statements, one complete thought. This is what people who stay in love do. This is what it looks like to stay in love. So where do you go with this? Because if you assume the worst, even if there's plenty of history in the relationship, even if you've experienced enough disappointment and pain, maybe betrayal, maybe loss of trust, listen, every time you choose to go negative, you are contributing to the demise of your relationship. Every time you choose to think the worst, you become a participant in the relationship's failure. And even if it seems justified, and even if there's a history of it, when you assume the worst, it gets expressed in your attitude, and in your tone, and in your words, and in your actions, and it hurts them. Every time you go negative, you contribute and participate to the destruction of the very thing you vowed to cherish the most. And I'm not saying it's all your fault. Obviously, we have 2 people in this relationship. I get it. There's a lot of other conversations we could be having right now that play into this. But what I'm saying, the couples who stay in love realize that this is my responsibility, no matter what the other does. Because let me tell you something about the person that you love, regardless of how much you feel like they have let you down and disappointed you. Nobody. The last thing that they want to do is to disappoint you. Wives, listen. Husbands, listen. Listen. It is not their life's ambition to make you miserable. It is not their goal to make you disappointed. I don't care how bad the relationship is. I don't care how unhealthy they may be. I don't care how bad the history might be. The last thing they want to do is for you to feel disappointed in who they are and what they do and in their behavior. I don't care who you are. A human reality is nobody wants to disappoint the people we're in relationship with. That's why even if your mom and dad weren't healthy people, you still didn't want to lose their approval. You never wanted to disappoint your father or your mother, regardless of whether they were a healthy person or not, because it's in you to want the approval and not to disappoint the people who matter the most to you. But when you go negative, when you assume the worst, what it communicates to that person that you love the most is no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, you're never going to measure up. You're never going to hit the standard. It's impossible. You will never be or get to be where I expect you to be. And every time you communicate that to the person you love, whether it's directly or indirectly, you push them further and further away from you because they feel like they're nothing but a disappointment to you. Maybe that's the secret that will save your relationship with your spouse, maybe your kids, maybe a friend. And in your mind, you're thinking, look, if you want to stop disappointing me, then all you got to do is close the gap. Work harder. Come on, dude, pick it up. Do better. These 2 things. When you do that, I'll be better. I'll be fine. Perform. Do more. Close the gap. Work harder. That's not how you fix this. That's not how you decrease disappointment in the relationship. The only way to fix this is to break the negative cycle. And one of the most powerful things you and I can do when there's a gap to communicate to the person we love that they haven't disappointed us and to rebuild trust and get our relationships out of the toilet bowl is to choose to believe the best. Even if there's a pattern of them not being everything you think they should be. Because when you do that, that creates space in the relationship and margin in the relationship, and they can breathe. And that breathing room they'll respond to that and move in your direction, because we all want to be loved like this, unconditionally. But if you have consistently assumed the worst about your partner, years, months, however long you've been together, I'm going to tell you something that's really just true, whether you want to hear it or not. They are scared of you. If you've consistently had a bad attitude when there's been a gap, if you've consistently criticized and complained about how they're not good enough, they dread sending the text or making the phone call. They don't want to disappoint you again. They don't want to hear you blow up. They are scared of what you're going to say and do. They do not want to be a disappointment to you again. So they put off making the call or sending the text. They don't like feeling like they don't measure up, because no one does. That's why when you choose to believe the best, oh my goodness, when you choose this, even if there's a gap, even if there's a history and a pattern, what this communicates is, I trust you. I trust you even before I hear your explanation. I trust you even before I understand all the circumstances of why there's a gap. I trust you. I trust you. I will believe the best about you until you give me a reason not to. Until you show me that that trust was really unwise. Trust in a relationship means I accept you no matter what. You have not disappointed me. That's unconditional love. That's the love God has for you. That's the love God wants for us to have for one another. And here's how this might sound. Honey, I'm running late. I'm not going to be able to make it home. I'm not going to be able to stop off on the way and get. I know you wanted me to. And she says, instead of blowing up, she says, oh, honey, it's okay. Just take your time. I'll be here waiting. No rush, no rush. What? Who stole my wife, right? Some of you are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Because what you've done in that moment is all of a sudden you created margin and space. Oh, I can breathe. Honey, I forgot to pay that bill. Oh, man, there was so much going on. I forgot to pay that bill. Instead of, aha, I knew you never do what you say you're going to do. You low-down, dirty dog. But what did I marry you for? And all the things you're tempted to say, right? No. It's okay. It's okay. You have so much going on. I shouldn't have even put that on you. I should have taken care of that. Love required that I should have recognized that you were overwhelmed. I should have stepped in. It's okay. We'll figure it out. There's a grace period. We'll be good. You had a lot on your mind. If you want to stay in love, you're going to make space for grace in your relationship. Let me just come into this thought for a second. That's exactly what God did for you. He's right all the time. He's God. Perfect, standard, boom. We never measure up. Holy. But if we want a relationship and we want to stay in love, I'm going to make space for this. I know you. You're not what you did. You're better than that. I have a plan and a future that's better than your past. I sent my son to die for you so you could have hope and life in me and forgiveness of sins. If you don't have grace in your relationships with one another, guys, you won't have love for very long. Trusting and believing the best, it creates room for the relationship to breathe and space for love to grow. And it's powerful. Trust is powerful. Belief is life-giving. And we all want to be loved this way. We all want to be trusted like this. We all live up to or down to the things that people think, say, and speak to us and do to us. If we want to change the cycle, if we want love to grow, then you got to understand healthy people create a healthier cycle. We don't stay in the negative. Even if you growing up in your house with your parents and their example, it was a generational curse, just critical. You got to recognize, you got to break that cycle. You can change things for your relationship. And God wants to help you do that. We all want this kind of love for ourselves, but the ones that we're in relationship with, they want it too. Instead of using the gap to make a point or to be right, leverage the gap as an opportunity to love and trust the person you're in a relationship with so they can move in your direction and love can grow. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying before we get out of here. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I am not saying that you don't confront the realities of why there is a gap. Right? There are times, would you agree, there are times we need to talk about the gap. We've got to talk about this. We've got to get on the same page. You said, but you did. The reality is there's a gap. We got to talk about that because sometimes this could be painful, hurtful. So we could struggle with this. Where were you? Why were you out so long? Who were you with? All the things. We got to talk about the gap. You all following me? But once you've worked it out and you're not mad anymore and the dust has settled, then the next time something happens that you see, reminds you of what happened in the past, you've got a choice to make, don't you? Will you believe the best or will you assume the worst? If you want to stay in love, this is the choice that you will make. And it might take everything in you to do. And it might be the hardest thing you've ever done to choose to believe the best, especially after what you see, what they did, and how you feel. But this is where you need God's help. Because you can't do this on your own. And some of us have had relationships where if we were left to our own strength, we'll never be able to do that again. And this is what I love about God. He loves us so much that he gives us the strength and the power to do what we never could do on our own. Because let me tell you something about your spouse's heart. Regardless if they have disappointed you and hurt you and betrayed you, your partner's heart is just like yours, just like mine. And our hearts are drawn toward an environment where it's healthy, where there's acceptance. God made you that way, and God made me that way. And so even if there's a pattern, even if there's a history, even if it feels justified for you to do this, when you make the choice to believe the best, it's an opportunity to draw your spouse, your partner, in your direction, just like you did when you first fell in love. Because he might come home or she might come home, but if it's an environment where they never measure up and they're always criticized or they get raked over the coals, I promise you their heart doesn't come home with them. No matter how bad they may want it to, they will build a wall around you. And they may be there with their body, but they will not be there with their heart. Because my heart, just like your heart, is drawn towards environments of safety and acceptance. So every time there's a gap, you've got a choice to make. Will you accept them and believe the best, or will you reject them and believe and assume the worst? Will you endure all things? Will you hope all things? Will you believe all things? Will you bear all things? Will you be willing in the gap to put this word, trust? Always, I will trust you. Because couples who choose to stay in love trust until there's absolutely no other way for me to trust you. And that point does happen, and I realize that. But until that point, we choose, no matter what we see, and no matter what we've experienced, I will intentionally choose to trust you and to believe the best about you. There's got to be a good reason for why there's a gap. Trust doesn't happen accidentally. It's an intentional choice. And let me just say this before we pray and get out of here. The alternative is no way to live, is it? You will never lead your relationship in a positive direction if all you pour into it is negativity. So what if you decided that no matter what you see, no matter what you've experienced, that you're going to do this for the person that you love? What would change in your marriages, in your families? What would change if you began to believe the best today instead of assuming the worst? My bet is a lot would probably change. Maybe it would change for the better today. And that begins right here, right now, in our minds. And you're going to have the chance to do this as soon as you leave this auditorium. You're going to get in the car, and maybe it's going to be when you get home today, and the room that he promised to clean up, he didn't clean up yet, did he? Or those trash cans still haven't been taken out yet, or whatever the gap is between your expectation and their behavior. What choice are you going to make today? Will you choose to give a generous explanation, or will you choose to assume the worst? Because whatever you choose, remember this, it's your choice. It's not their fault what you choose. Happy couples who stay in love learn to believe the best. Let's stand together. Let me pray for us. Is it possible for two people who fall in love to stay in love together forever? Yes. If those two people make love a verb. And if they take their cues from Jesus and surrender their rights and what they feel like they deserve, and instead of insisting what they deserve to be right, they surrender it so they can have a relationship. And we pay attention to the things that are inside of our own hearts so they don't come out and damage the person we care about. And when we learn to fill in the gap with trust. So if you're in love I pray that you stay in love and that love gets stronger and fiercer. And if you're not in love, I hope you fall in it, and I hope you fall in it deep, and I hope you learn what to do so you can stay in it forever. Father, right now we thank you. We thank you for you, the way you love us. Thank you for these scriptures that have been preserved for thousands of years so we could hear today a conversation that would help our lives. But here and now we acknowledge that to do this well requires a strength that none of us have on our own. So I pray if there's anyone here today who knows that they can't do it without your help, I pray that today would be the day they move in the direction of faith and accept that, Jesus, you really are who you say you are, and you really can do what you promised to do, which is to save us and transform us and make us more like you. And you are the model for love because you loved us so perfectly. So if you're here this morning, I encourage you, have faith in Jesus. Believe in who he is and what he says he can do. Ask him to forgive you of your sins. This is what you need to have the power from God to do what we're talking about in this series. As we leave here today, Lord, I pray, give us the courage, the wisdom to know what to do and the courage to do it no matter how hard it is. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.